or affiliations, the DeYoung Open epitomizes the Fine Arts Museum's values of equity, inclusion, accessibility, and diversity. The DeYoung Open aspires to magnify the visions and voices of artists who are rooted locally, but thinking globally about the world we live in. The DeYoung Open represents a significant paradigm shift from historical perceptions of museums as guardians and gatekeepers of culture to a more democratic model in which museums foreground the visions and voices of local artists. And unlike most museum exhibitions that can take years of planning, sometimes up to 5 years, the DeYoung Open was organized and it was in 2020 as well, in 4 months. And so you really take the pulse of what Bay Area artists are seeing and thinking and feeling with a sense of immediacy and urgency. Unlike so many art museum invitationals that feature and anoint a select few, the DeYoung Open seeks the greatest possible representation in its nearly floor-to-ceiling salon-style installation of artworks by 883 artists. We hope to foster dialogues and opportunities for these artists, both through direct sales to museum visitors. I've thankfully received many emails from artists who've already sold multiple works, but also by networking with curators, collectors, critics, and dealers. Several artists in the 2020 DeYoung Open actually secured dealer representation, which is fabulous. The 883 artworks on view manifest seemingly every possible style and subject, but also include works that typically would be excluded from most modern or contemporary art museums for not being sufficiently avant-garde, whatever that might mean. The scale and salon style of the exhibition more accurately reflects the broad spectrum of arts being created here in the Bay Area and empower viewers to make their own judgments regarding the content and quality of these works. It is self-evident that museums would not exist without the artists who make their existence possible. One of the DeYoung Open artists accurately described the exhibition as, quote, a giant love letter to the artists of the Bay Area, unquote. Historical artworks provide the foundations upon which museums rest, but contemporary artworks connect the past to the present and the present to the past in an eternal rhythm of call and response. The DeYoung Open is not perfect because it was created by 883 human beings with human minds, eyes, and hands, but it epitomizes humanism and humanist values in an age that is increasingly dominated by non-human and sometimes inhuman technology. We hope that the DeYoung, an exhibition by, for, and of the people of the Bay Area, will serve as a catalyst for meaningful change in museums around the Bay Area and beyond. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Bay Area artist and educator Sonny A. Smith. Smith served as a DeYoung Open juror this year, as you all know, and has produced work for 25 solo shows exhibiting their work at museums including SF MoMA, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, the Contemporary Jewish Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the Palais de Tokyo, and Mass MoCA, among others. Smith has received the United States Artists Fellowship, the Foundation for Contemporary Arts Grant to Artists Award, the Artadia Award, and the Fleischacker Foundation Eureka Award. Their work is held in the permanent collections of nearly 40 museums, including the Whitney Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Hammer Museum, the Saatchi Gallery, and the Brooklyn Museum. Their work was part of the recent Swain Family Foundation acquisition for the DeYoung's permanent collection, a selection of which is up on view in the first floor galleries. And Smith currently serves as professor and dean of fine arts at the California College of the Arts here in San Francisco. So, Sonny, thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program titled Coming Full Circle, DeYoung Open Artists in Conversation. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. My name is Sonny A. Smith. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a trans, non-binary artist and educator here in San Francisco since 2008. So I'm celebrating my 15th year as a professor and my 5th year as Dean of Fine Arts at California College of the Arts. I am humbled and grateful to be living and working as an uninvited guest upon the unceded ancestral homelands of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone-speaking peoples, and I had the distinct honor of serving as a juror for this year's DeYoung Open 2023 exhibition, alongside distinguished artists Claire Rojas, Stephanie Sihuko, and Shas Chia. I am delighted to be here with you today in conversation with three of the DeYoung Open 2020 exhibiting artists, Cheryl Derricotte, Rupy C, and Ron Moultrie Saunders, whose work is also currently on view in the 2023 edition. For today's program, each artist will be presenting a 7 to 10 minute talk on their work. Then we will move into about 30 minutes of conversation, followed by questions from you, our audience. So first, I will go ahead and introduce the three artists. Cheryl Derricotte, I'm working the French accent for you, is a visual artist, originally from Washington, D.C., working primarily in glass, paper, and public art. She holds degrees in urban affairs, history, regional planning, ceramics, sculpture, and fine arts from Barnard College, Columbia University, Cornell University, the Corcoran School of Art, and the California Institute of Integral Studies, respectively. In 2021, she was awarded the commission to develop a monument to Harriet Tubman for the Transit-Oriented Development Gateway at Millbrae Station entitled Freedom's Threshold. Additional honors include serving as Municipal Artist-in-Residence for the City of Berkeley's Climate Equity Pilot Program at Kala Art Institute, the inaugural Emerging Artist Residency at the Museum of the African Diaspora, inaugural BIPOC residency at the Corning Museum of Glass, and the Black Space Artist Residency at Minnesota Street Projects. She was named one of Yerba Buena Center for the Arts YBCA 100 honorees, the Wingate Craft Fellow at the Vermont Studio Center, and Rick and Val Beck Scholarship Awardee for Glass Art at Penland School of Crafts. Her work is in the permanent collections of the DeYoung Museum, the Historic New Orleans Collection, the Oakland Museum of California, and the National Association of Home Builders. A licensed city planner and member of the American Institute of Certified Planners since 1995, she also serves as the Professional Development Officer of the New Arts and Planning Division of the American Planning Association. Next up, we will have Rupy C, who studied evolutionary and ecological biology, South Asian studies, and global health at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Loma Linda University. She creates paintings rooted in personal history on paper and linen using handmade pigments. The grandchild of Punjabi Sikh refugees, an immigrant, a mother, and a preservationist of traditional Indian painting, also known as miniature painting, techniques in use since the 18th century AD. Her meticulous line work explores the relationship to homeland and the criteria of belonging as an immigrant and a woman. Honors include a Kala Institute Fellowship, a residency at the Kapani Collection of Fine Art, Sikh Foundation in Palo Alto, a grant from the Institute of Contemporary, from the City of Oakland Cultural Funding Program. She's produced solo exhibitions including Out of Place, Up Now at the Institute of Contemporary Art San Francisco, Search and Rescue at Jessica Silverman Gallery, A Recipe for Brown Skin at the Triton Museum of Art in Santa Clara, and A Journey Back Home at the Peel Art Gallery and Museum Archives in Ontario. Her work is in the permanent collection of the Crocker Art Museum, Sacramento, the DeYoung Museum, and the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, and she's currently represented by Jessica Silverman Gallery here in San Francisco. And finally, we have Ron Moultrie Saunders, originally from Jamaica, Queens, New York, and current resident of San Francisco's Bayview neighborhood, who is a photographic artist who creates photographs that are made without the use of a camera, as well as a landscape architect and teacher with undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Awards and honors include the 2021-22 Kala Fellowship Award, artist grants from the San Francisco Arts Commission, commissions for Facebook, Stanford University, and BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, including 2 commissions just this past year. His art has been exhibited throughout the U.S., including his ongoing series, Beneath My Skin is the History of My Beauty, and The Secret Life of Plants, which were showcased at venues such as San Francisco International Airport, Branston Gallery, and the San Francisco Arts Commission Gallery. He's a co-founding member of 3.9 Art Collective, a collective of Black artists, curators, and art writers who came together to draw attention to the city's dwindling Black population, to bear witness to this phenomenon, and to reverse it by drawing attention to the historical and ongoing presence of Black artists and creative expression within SF's Black communities. The 3.9 Art Collective was a YBCA 100 honoree in 2023. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Cheryl Derricotte, who will start us off with her presentation. Thank you.
That was like the perfect French pronunciation. We were talking earlier, and she said, "How do you pronounce your name?" And I said, "Oh, Derricotte, please." And they said, "Really?" And then the French came, so it was really fun. I'm going to start my timer. Thank you for that generous introduction, Sunny. Thank you, Tim, and all at the DeYoung for this opportunity. And it's really exciting because, as many of you know, 2020 was quite a year, and there are probably more people in this auditorium than those who saw the show in 2020, because unfortunately, we were open, we were closed, we were open. So it was a really tough time. This is actually the flyer from 2020 that had all of our names. And then this is my work that was in the show that was ultimately acquired by the DeYoung for the Achenbach Print Foundation collection. The piece is called, as you see, 2017 Year at a Glance, 214 Dead Black Men. It's part of a suite of 5 works spanning 2016 through 2020. When I started the work, initially I was mining data from The Guardian, who had begun to track killings. And then I shifted to the Washington Post, not just because I'm originally from Washington, D.C., but because the Post actually continued the series longer than The Guardian took it up. Each of the bullets I hand stamp in ink on the calendar, and we begin to see, unfortunately, that this is a level of violence that's become normalized in our society. I usually start all my talks by saying that I stand for art and liberation, and because Sunny did a wonderful land acknowledgement, I will not do that as well because they did a great job. But I think it's important to put the work in context as an artist who is always concerned with issues in contemporary society. And I think in 2020, the DeYoung showed that it too stood for art and liberation because the theme was on the edge and much of the artwork embraced our challenges as a society that year. And then if you're really lucky, you get a birthday present because my birthday is February 21st and February 19th, I woke up to my phone blowing up with texts and friends going, "Did you know you're in the New York Times?" And I was like, "No, that's really something." And there it was. So it was a wonderful treat. And I think we were all really grateful that so many papers embraced the story of the DeYoung Open during that time. As mentioned in my bio, I was the inaugural BIPOC artist last year at the studio at Corning, which was really exciting. For those of you who have not traveled to New York, the Corning Museum also has a full glass studio. And in addition to having artist residencies, you could go with your family and visit and do some glass blowing and work in the studio as part of your visit. I, as you see in this picture, do what's called powder printing or enamel work on glass. So I actually do that with screens of a variety of meshes. And the work I worked on at Corning was a conceptual portrait for James Hemings. Many of us know Sally Hemings, the woman that bore 6 of former President Thomas Jefferson's children, but a lot of people don't know as much about her brother, older brother, James, who actually traveled first with Jefferson to France and rose to the level of chef de cuisine. He was fluent in French as well as English. And the work that you see is actually the only saved handwriting of James Hemings. It's an inventory of the kitchen utensils in Monticello. And so during my time at Corning, I began to partner with glass blowers and explore making works actually drawn from the inventory in a sculptural form. So in this case, the cast iron skillet, because in the inventory you see a certain number of iron skillets that were listed in the work. And then the other thing I've been up to since 2020 and the DeYoung Open, for about 2.5 years, I was working on Freedom's Threshold, which just opened March 16th at the new Gateway at Millbrae Station, mixed-use development. It's right at the BART station, and there are a ton of new buildings there, a new hotel, and in addition to my sculpture, you can walk around and see a number of public artworks that were placed on site. The lower rendering sort of shows the architect's view of what it looked like, and the real buildings actually look like perfectly like that, so it's a treat. My sculpture is actually 12 feet tall. It's powder-coated aluminum, and the center image, which includes Harriet Tubman's likeness in 8 feet, is all glass. And so I handmade the 12 glass tile insets in my studio in the Bayview, again, using that powder printing technique that you saw in the Corning slide. The sculpture is based on the side profile of Harriet Tubman's home. One of the things that I think kind of got lost in history is that Harriet Tubman was very much a person interested in philanthropy. She owned 32 acres of property, and the property had about 5 buildings on it in addition to her home, and she left that to her local AME Zion Church, which still stewards the property today and is a National Park Service site, historic site. And so in thinking about what story to tell in a California context, in a new development, at a train station, I wanted to go a little further than just Underground Railroad, which was the obvious tie-in, and really show Harriet Tubman, the developer, Harriet Tubman, the property owner, Harriet Tubman, the philanthropist. And so in closing, I would like to invite you all to some shows. I currently have work up at St. Joseph's Art Society in a show guest curated by Shar Ekandayu called Tracking Immortality, Landscapes on Safety. And on November 7th, I'll be in conversation with Ashara and Kijo Lee, the curator at the Museum of the African Diaspora, from 6 to 8, and that is free, and you are all invited to attend that. If you can travel, I currently have work in A Two-Way Mirror, Double Consciousness in Contemporary Glass by Black artists, and this show just opened last weekend at the museum. I'm really honored to be in that as well. It's the first major retrospective of contemporary glass exclusively by Black artists. And that big cone you see is actually the hot shop at the museum. So again, this is a space where if you visit, you can see glass blowing happening. This is a view of my work. I did 2 pieces for this show. It's a total suite of 5 works, but the museum selected these 2. Both pictures are of all Black boys who worked in the glass factories at the turn of the last century. When I began this work, like a lot of my work, I'd seen a historical image. I thought, that's interesting. Who are those children? And why does it say glass factory in West Virginia? And as I began to dive down the rabbit hole of that research, I learned so much about the fact that at the turn of the last century, although America was incredibly segregated, the factory floor was not. And so you see a number of images of these boys who were aged 10 to 16 at best, that included Black children. Technically they were white, but, as we know now, these were Irish American children, these were Italian American children, these were Jewish American children, and you get a really good lens on how capitalism was constructed in America. And then Last but not least, I have a solo show coming up at my gallery, Re-Riddle, in the Minnesota Street Project. So I would like to invite you all Friday, November 17th to that opening. And that is all. If you would like to stay in touch, this is the way to do it. And thank you all very much again for coming today. And thank you to the DeYoung Museum for making such a wonderful opportunity for local artists.
I'm going to try to not put a timer, but if I go over, I think Maria will say this. It's an honor to be here. I think even walking today through the DeYoung Open 2023, there were a lot of people there, and I felt like that was not there in 2020. And somehow the people made the show even more of a layered experience, I would say. But the DeYoung 2020 was an interesting time for me. I think on December 2nd is when we had the panel with Tim and with Oren and Avery and myself. And December 3rd was when I was in the hospital giving birth to twins. So it was an interesting time for me, you can say. And I think for any woman who is about to be a mother to 3 children at that point, and to someone who is working at a practice, you don't necessarily expect for your career to take off at that moment when you don't have the capacity also, but then when you don't imagine it to be happening. But that's exactly what happened. And how do I describe what's happened since the DeYoung 2020? When I was speaking to the team, the programs team, I was like, I feel like I'm one of the poster children for DeYoung 2020 because there's so much that's happened. And what's happened most significantly for me is that I've kind of learned how to grow into this tall stature that I have. And I'll go through that more as I go through these slides. This is one of the paintings that was part of the DeYoung 2020. And what I want to say that what happened before that was this. I'm an artist who was born in India, who moved here at the age of 12. I know what it is to feel not at home, and I know what it is to search for home and belonging for the rest of your life. But also I know that because my grandparents talked about these stories of them leaving their home when I was about 5 or 6 or 7, when they were telling me these stories as bedtime stories. So I think for me, constantly my practice has been about finding belonging. And I think as a woman, as a mother, that is something we go through every day, depending on the door we're walking through. But for me in my practice, what's kept me grounded all those years before 2020 and since has been this really strict, tedious, laborious practice that is more popularly known as Indian miniature painting, which is more of a colonial label for it, I would say. But what I call Indian painting. And traditionally, this is a practice that takes a lot of I would say, physical labor to make your own pigments, to prepare the paper the way you want to use it, and then to engage in a methodology that is very specific, very orderly, and very much, I would say, at a level that if you have not committed to that, you're definitely not going to make it to the composition and painting stage. And within that, also, there's a visual language that I'm trying to keep alive that is also, like Sunny said, from the 18th century. But at the same time, that visual language was developed by mostly male painters, which didn't center female narratives, and it didn't have female painters painting these paintings. So for me, as an artist practicing today, I not only am I looking for, people who look like me, women who look like me, or my grandmothers, or my mom in a painting, so I make them and I create them, but also a way of not erasing the existence of women, the experience of women anymore. And, highlighting the silences that have kind of been left there and not looked at. So that's what was there before the 2020 and has stayed there. The practice is still as grueling, and I still don't have an assistant. This painting was The Time Traveler, which was part of the Open in 2020. The most significant bit about this painting is that this was the first time, this was painted kind of digesting what was happening in California at the time, the Paradise Fire, the Camp Fire. And I really wondered, what would my ancestors think about what is happening to the land around me? And, anytime a disaster happens, I always I wonder what they've picked up and taken with them. And you can imagine a child who's grown up with stories of refugees and who's an immigrant. This is a question I ask myself often. What do I take? What am I going to take? And so in this instance, when I was reflecting on, the people who are leaving their homes, losing their homes, I wondered, if there was a piece of wisdom that my ancestors could impart on me. And I think that's how this idea of painting ancestors in my work started. And she was the first ancestor coming into this world that was on fire, but also having some sort of foresight and insight into that, and which is another thing I'll come to later. This was the second painting that was in the DeYoung Open 2020 titled Machinery of Oppression. And I think there is a part of me that, I usually never paint men, but this is the one time I do paint men. And the reason is that I do feel there is an explanation for the imperialistic, capitalistic, colonialist machineries that are happening around us and those who are being oppressed by it. And I think we often sometimes presume that women are not going to paint about that. But the thing is that we are the ones who are under the most amount of pressure because of those machineries. And I feel that is a responsibility I take on for myself as a painter, that those are some social-political commentaries that I need to continue make through my work. And since this piece, there has been another in that line of work that I won't share here, but it's called Tea in the Garden by the river next to the wall, and the wall is a wall of corpses. And then there's this imperial character having tea in the garden. Just like it happened for many of us in the pandemic, for me as well, the pandemic was a moment of, like I said, I was obviously giving birth to twins, but also at the same time, I was coping with a lot of isolation and kind of digesting and deconditioning myself of all the patriarchal deconditioning and of all the baggage that comes with being a mother, being an artist, and being a woman. And at that point, I realized that not only is my way of making sometimes not given, is also being erased somewhat. So if you imagine that I spend 2 weeks making the pigments for a painting, that takes about a month. And those 2 weeks are nowhere to be found on a wall when that painting is put on a wall. So for me, this work and 5 others were then about giving the space to the pigments and letting them be there as well and letting that surface a little bit. But then again, going to that character of, or that requirement of superhumanhood that I felt at that point, and then there's this character depicting that superhumanhood, as a painter who was doing all of this, but then so many other people around me keeping it together and doing it as well. At the end of the day, we were all kind of given a needle to fix a really big problem, whether it's in our communities, whether it's in our own families, whether it's in our own lives. And this was, I guess, the next step in my practice, which was to kind of imagine myself in my work as well and pour that in and not necessarily put that away and not necessarily put that in a pocket to survive and to move on, but to recognize it and then bring it into the work. And this next painting was part of the solo that, I've had 3 solos since the DeYoung 2020, and this was one of the solos that's called The Recipe for Brown Skin. And I'll tell you a little bit about the title is that within this traditional making that is, obviously, a practice that has its origins in India. I'm trained in the style that's from northern India. But within this style, the recipe for a really light, fair skin is very easy to find and to be trained in. But the recipe for brown skin is actually very difficult. And there has not been recorded. So for me, coming up with a recipe of brown skin is also part of my practice. But that was the title of that solo at the Triton Museum. And this triptych called A New Normal was, again, me questioning, what did my grandmothers feel for this earth? How did they take care of it? And then why don't we look at them as climate experts? Why do climate experts need to be a certain skin color, a certain educational background? And weren't these women also climate experts? And this is part of the Swain acquisition. So I think it'll go on exhibit maybe next year here at the DeYoung. My next solo titled Search and Rescue. And I feel like all my solos are titled very kind of urgently, but Search and Rescue was again, a product of what the pandemic was, to then search myself again and then rescue yourself from self, as many of us might have gone through. But for me, this painting from that solo called A Woman Like Me is what I felt at that moment, having this solo in a beautiful gallery and me being this, artist who's walking in, who's, I think I was still breastfeeding the kids, and it was not a place where you naturally feel you fit in. And for me, I think this has been a constant, is to find women like me in history, but also in places I walk in. And I hope that someday I'm that woman that they find in a place that somebody else walks into, someone who looks like them, someone who doesn't erase motherhood, talks about it, and someone who doesn't erase the experience that, we all have, that we feel are more difficult things to talk about, or maybe not as glamorous, but they need to be put out there. And for me, this painting was a very important painting of that solo, called Heroine. It's at the Asian Art Museum. It'll go on view on January 20th, part of a group show. This was the first painting where it's about 3 feet by 5 feet. And this was the first time I painted a really large brown woman on, this handmade paper that I get from India. It was significant for me because I walked into the gallery and I saw her taking up so much space. And I know it sounds very obvious, but as someone who takes up space because I'm tall and I'm, outspoken, this was the first time my paintings did that. And I was like, okay, I'm going to hold that really close. So for the current solo that's at the ICA San Francisco, there's 5 paintings and they're all about 3 by 5 or even larger. And there are these, large brown women that I've painted that reflect not only my ancestry, but also a way of bridging the past and future through understanding the present better, to understanding how different ways of looking at things and different ways of expressing are finding and meeting each other in a painting. And also then to paint characters that don't generally make it into paintings. In the traditional style I've been trained in, I think there's only 2, and that style spans centuries, there's only 2 portraits of pregnant women that I've come across. And, I feel like as a mother, America is kind of framing me to become a mother, but not respecting my reproductive choices, and framing me to give birth, but not protecting my children. So for me to paint this vulnerable woman, this woman in a state of vulnerability, was very important. And to have it there as someone who's worthy of portraiture beyond just the pregnancy portraits that are so part of our, way of celebrating birth, maybe. And I'll end with, you can see some details here with the eyes on her suit. I'll end with this painting, which is, the last painting that was painted for that solo called Searching for Ancestors. And for me, I think America is home when I can imagine myself in it, but I can also imagine my ancestors in it. When I can imagine making a history here, but also imagine the histories of the people that I represent and that I come from are also noticed and are also even taught here in the US. And that's not a reality yet, but I think that is a very, very specific requirement I have before I can call it home. And I'll end it there, and there's a detail here for you to look at. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see your faces on this beautiful day. And I want to thank everyone for coming, and I also want to especially acknowledge the staff at the DeYoung for creating this program around the show, the DeYoung Open to 2023. And as was mentioned before, and thank you, Sunny, for your great introduction about my work and me and where I'm from. And in 2020, I took a chance and entered this piece that you see up here called Perhaps Because of the Near Darkness You Can See Me, which is based on a line from Invisible Man written by Ralph Ellison. And throughout my work, when I deal with portraiture work, I constantly talk about visibility and invisibility. And this triptych is a cameraless process called photograms, where I physically lay people and objects on the paper. And I'm pushing the boundaries of what photograms can do. So since this show, I was actually very fortunate during the pandemic to have several art commissions to work on, public and private. And that's what my presentation is going to reflect. And the next, This is a project that I did for Stanford University. I was given the opportunity to take my photograms and add color. So typically my photograms are black and white, and sometimes they get sepia tone. So you'll see there's some sepia tone images up here, as well as color. The color is added digitally. And I'm very much interested in the environment. My background is as a landscape architect. And how can I bring the conversation about our environment into a beautiful form that people could be drawn into? So this is in a residential tower on Stanford's campus. And I circumvented the tower building to select my plant material. So I wanted the plants to be from the campus. I wanted them to be really close to the residential tower so that when the students walked into the building and they saw this imagery, they would be able to make a connection directly to the plants that are surrounding them. And it's a subtle way of talking about the environment, but also it's a way to entice people to think about the environment they're in. The panels are 24 inches by 30 inches, so the piece is approximately 8 feet tall by 7 feet wide. This next work is a project that I did for the San Francisco Art Commission, and it's the Southeast Family Health Center in Bayview. It's a community I live in. It used to be predominantly Black. It is now gentrified. And I wanted to acknowledge the history of the health clinics in the Bayview, which were created by people in the community who were like, how can we bring healthcare into our community? And they developed a clinic. The clinic outgrew its space. They decided to build a new building. It's 2 stories, and they commissioned artists to do work for the project. So what I did is I decided to focus on plants that originated in Africa, and this is called African origins. The plant that you see that's sepia toned is called Amaryllis belladonna, and most of the plants have healing properties. If you take a close look at them, we're not using these plants anymore in our pharmaceutical work, but these plants had properties that were used in Africa. So I'm trying to bring these plants back to the community to acknowledge the African American community that was there. So what I did, the image is originally 8 inches square. It was scanned. I reversed it to get the white background, and then in Photoshop added blue. And the panels that were created are glass panels that separate the staff area from the client waiting area. And the staff can see the image as well as the staff. And it's visible on both sides because there is a sandblasted glass that allows light to go through, but it also creates privacy for both sides of the staff. This is called acacia, and everybody knows most acacias come from Africa. It was also used as a healing plant. So again, people are introduced to these plants not realizing that they have healing properties. And I wanted to bring that into the forefront as well. I was fortunate enough to have 4 projects that I was working on. And because of the young open, I realized that I could really push the limits of what I'm doing. When I presented this work, my portfolio, to professional people, and they saw the pretty photograms that I was doing with plants, they didn't understand how I could take it any further. I decided that I could, and that was stepping into the public art arena and saying, let's enlarge this, let's put it on different materials, let's engage the public to talk about nature and environment. And it's an easy way in to do that. I was fortunate enough, I don't know how the curator found me. I don't know if the curator found me through the Young Open 2020 or if they found me through Minnesota Street Projects, but I was approached by Facebook to do a project for them. And this one is called We Are Water. And this was installed in December of 2022. And I used 6 different images that were all black and white photograms of my body. I don't have the money to hire anybody to work with me. So I use myself as the subject. And I collage these different images together, reversed them, added blue to bring this into an office environment down in Sunnyvale to, again, to acknowledge and talk about water. So you can see a lot of my work is around the environment, but it also includes the body, to talk about not only is water surrounding us, but water is within us, and also to talk about how scarce water can be sometimes. I also got the opportunity to work on a project for BART. This is called Yellow Daisy, and I selected this image because when I was doing my reconnaissance in the 19th Street BART station area, I discovered that there were a lot of buildings with floral motifs on them. And the Art Deco buildings, the Paramount Theater, the Fox Theater, there was a Flower Mart there. If you look at the old I Magnum building, they all have these incredible floral patterns on them. And I decided this would be a great way to bring nature, a sense of nature, into this dark stairway that became a wayfinding mechanism, and also, again, to introduce that idea of the environment, to think about the things that you don't really pay attention to, and maybe you will start to look at them. This was a private commission. Again, I'm going back to the body, and I'm using the body to talk about my history, my heritage, to talk about the environment. And you can see some of them are in black and white because I'm pushing myself to go back to the traditional colors of black and white, because there are also these gray tones in those elements. The sepia tone can also talk about skin color. It can also talk about a warmness that's available to us as well. This is a project that I did for BART in San Francisco. And this is in the Tenderloin. It's located at 8th and Market. And I wanted something that talked about the Tenderloin, that talked about the resilience, the adaptability of the community. And so I chose a dragonfly wing. And this dragonfly wing represents the resilience of the community. And also the dragonfly can change direction abruptly. So I was really interested in researching how much resilience is in the Tenderloin community. I mean, it's one of the first places people who couldn't afford rich homes out in Nob Hill lived, because there was affordable housing for workers in this part of town. So you can see just by the work and the way I'm presenting it, I also do a lot of research into the communities that work goes into, because I want the people in those communities to have some attachment to the work. Yeah, and this is looking straight up at the piece. It's about 15 feet wide by 50 feet long. This is my largest art commission to date, and it's fiberglass, and so it's a bas relief, so there's a little bit of a sculptural element as well. And to close out, this is the piece that I currently have in the DeYoung Open 2023. And going back and looking at how can I talk about what's within me, what do I carry within me, what's my heritage, and then how can I reveal a little bit of that to the public? And so I'm holding this cotton ball. And that's it.
Hello? Yes, hello, can you hear me? Not quite yet. Hello? Okay. All right, well, first, just join me in thanking our artists for their beautiful presentations. So much to talk about. So I'm going to start us off with a question for each of you. You can each answer this. And some of you touched on this a little bit in your presentations, in the intro. We talked a little bit about this as well. So looking back to the first DeYoung Open in 2020, what do you recall most about the time period?
I will say that was a very challenging time period. Being in a studio environment was very challenging. We actually closed for 2 months. I'm at Minnesota Street Projects. Being the only Black male artist in the space was very challenging. We had discussions on Zoom about DEI and what can we do to make it better? How can we diversify the artists that are in the space? A lot of talk. Not a lot of changes until recently. And being isolated and not being able to go into this dark room was also very challenging. So that challenge pushed me to think creatively in different ways. And so I started experimenting with using my iPhone camera and saying, how can I do photograms with a camera since I can't go in the dark room? So I think faced with challenges, artists are very good at figuring out another route.
I think for me, it was such a shock when, the list, of course, looking back, we can almost chuckle about this too, but the list of essential services that came out. And of course, artists was nowhere. That was a huge jolt to my system. I remember that, my whole life is dedicated to this thing that I do, and it's not essential. And I think then eventually, of course, it was, that of course everybody was consuming art to survive and to get by. But that was, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to try to make sure that this counts as essential in whichever way I can. And that was one, very distinct memory. And again, because there was, it was a trying time for my body at that time. But I do remember that walking into the De Young and I was like waddling in. I was huge, I was pregnant with twins. So I was walking in to see the De Young open and even dropping off my work and that was the first time I met a friend at the drop off. And that was such a huge sigh of relief that, there are other people going through things, because we were so isolated. And in general, painters, as a painter, I feel I'm isolated. So these are some of the memories that stick out a lot. But, it was, even looking back at the photos, I was scrolling through the photos, trying to see if there's something that would fit that I would put in my presentation. But of course, it was such a surreal experience that and there's so many layers of it, but this was one very superficial but also direct experience that I felt as a maker at that point.
Yes, it was very strange. I don't think the aloneness bothered me as much, but I should say I'm an only child of a single mother, and so alone is kind of in my DNA, so that didn't bother me. But the studio closing really bothered me, and I think the reflection on glass as a practice, particularly glass blowing, when you have a virus that's airborne and suddenly people, can't just blow on a pipe like they used to, whoever passed by. So I think those kinds of things were really challenging to think about. I think the other side of my art practice began to flourish even more, which was print and bookmaking. The print making and bookmaking world were like rock stars on Zoom and shipping out kits and really building community online. So I think that was a plus, and I was very happy, to have that side of my art, while this other side was like, what are we doing? How are we going to be in studios again?
Thank you. Yeah, I think, with that question, I was hoping to kind of revisit the context of the pandemic and the uprisings for racial and social justice, the sense of holding so much collective grief, uncertainty, that word uncertainty even became its own sort of meme, the unprecedented. So it's interesting to see, to look back now at the DeYoung Open 2020 as a kind of snapshot of sorts of a time, and just hearing about, your experience of even, coming to the show or not getting to see it, coming to it and having not a lot of people there. It just remains such a potent time period. I think of Arundhati Roy's article that came out around that time, referring to the pandemic as a portal. And to me, that metaphor has really stuck with me, this incredible portal. And I'm not really sure that we're out of the portal yet. And of course, the title for today's program is Coming Full Circle, and just thinking about this moment, that we're in right now, which we can touch on as well. So I wanted to ask you all, what do you recall most about the opportunity and what it signified for you as an artist? And with this question, I would just love to explore your thoughts on the role of museums, both in times of crisis and in the Bay Area. Ideally, how do museums serve artists? How did you perceive the invitation, and what did you perhaps admire about it? What drew you to want to participate?
Well, I was in 2020, and I remember the theme and feeling like, oh, this might be the right theme for this work. I had been making work in that series about police brutality for a few years doing the test pieces. And, I had shown in a couple of places, Root Division being one. I'd only shown the work once at Root Division and once at a space in DC. And people were kind of like, oh, that's interesting, But then 2020, and it's like, whoa, police brutality, it's like a serious thing, not just in the context of, domestically with the killings of Black men by police, but then we begin to see internationally in London the highly publicized killing. I think it was Sarah Evershed, the woman that was killed by an off-duty cop. So there was a global context of understanding, police brutality. And I think that was great to have it uplifted locally through the DeYoung Open, and it sort of reaffirmed a thing that has always been important to me. I always feel like, museums and galleries can very much be the brave places for us to have difficult conversations as a society. So I kind of hold them to that standard and feel like it's my job as an artist to provide the work to facilitate that conversation within those spaces.
I forgot the question because I got so busy listening to you. But I think it was something about the role museums play, and then what was that submission process, but also the acceptance and all of that. Like, I almost didn't apply to the DeYoung 2020, and I was like, okay. To be completely honest, right? At that point, or at that time when you are a maker who makes this very specific, traditionally rooted work about a very specific ancestry, and then you were so truthful with it, you don't expect people to find relevance with it. And now, of course, having come full circle, I understand that as specific the work is to you, the more universal it becomes, right? So, but I didn't have that wisdom at that time, so I almost didn't apply. But I do remember that when I applied and when, I got the acceptance and having both the works accepted, and to know the thousands of submissions and then the hundreds of names that I was going to be in, and that first time that you walk in and look at that wall and your name is on a museum wall, you don't necessarily, this is one thing I have to give you context about, is that as a kid who was like around 11 when we were applying to the United States to move here, you don't know how many times I've written my name out on an application, or how many times you sound your name out for like immigration officers or anybody, and then how many times you write your name over and over again. And to see your name on a museum wall is a whole different experience at that point. And I'm not going to cry, but I think that was one very significant experience. And I think for me also, there was some part of my parents also accepting that, oh, okay, she's in a museum. And we come to this point now where they're like, which museum are you going to today? And there's a huge full circle moment here. And, the art form I do believes in life to be circular. That's the practice, and life is not linear. So for me, this is, that moment, and now definitely believing that life is circular. And I think so far the museums, the roles they do play is to put it simply, is to display as many diverse names on the wall as possible. And those names are important. The identities they represent, even walking today, I know we'll come to that question later, but it's very important to see your name or someone whose name sounds like you on a wall. And it's very important to see a different way of making on a wall. And I never imagined that the way of making that is, an inner struggle for myself to know that women can hold this paintbrush with this knowledge. And, I'm that person who's trying to do that. And to see that making then be next to those who do it very differently or do it, come with a very different perspective and approach, that was another huge moment to see my work next to work that was so different. And to see it against so many different works too, and so many conversations happening. It was so overwhelming, but also now looking back, it was so important. Yeah.
It was incredibly validating. I think the theme was really appropriate for my work. However, I didn't know if it would be accepted. And what I've learned recently about the work, because it's a series, it's not just those 3 images. I've done different variations. It was used on a postcard and for a group show that I was in, and one of the recipients of that card, who goes to the gallery a lot, they had problems looking at the image. And that's one of the things I like my work to do, to evoke different responses, because everybody should bring themselves to the work. I should not have to tell you how to think or look at the work. But to see the work in the museum was astounding. And to see it with other work of the same caliber or higher was very rewarding. And I also think it's very important for museums to have shows like this. I know we're going to come to this, but one of the things that it can do is to bring communities of people into museums that are not used to coming into places like this. And I think it's so important. And that's one of the reasons I do public artwork, is to take that fine artwork into communities and say, you can do this. These things are available to you at museums, at galleries. So I hope that opens people's minds and gives a think about the opportunities that could be presented to them when they're seeing work like this in museums.
Wow. Well, I hope I hope the DeYoung is from all of your lips to the gods and the museum, directors and curators of the world. What a testament to what something like this can do for artists and for communities and for expanding audiences, and just the profound meaning that can have, and the ripple effects of that. I think some of you have already spoken to this question, but in case there's more to elaborate on this, how did your participation in the 2020 DeYoung Open impact your artistic practice or career? I know some of you spoke about that in your presentations. I'm just curious, if you'd like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit more about how your work evolved, or some, professional, contacts or networks or surprises that came along for you that you weren't expecting, again, as a way to kind of demonstrate why the exhibition is important as an ongoing triennial, and an opportunity for others that you're kind of leading and modeling forward for other artists to come.
Well, I don't know. Part of the reason I didn't apply this year is because lightning does not strike in the same place twice. And so I just wanted to enjoy everything about the 2020 DeYoung Open. And I didn't really have a long, extensive press list before. And suddenly when you've got New York Times and The Guardian and the San Francisco Chronicle and your artwork featured, thank you, DeYoung, that was amazing. And we were talking with the staff earlier, and I know she's retired now, but to get an email on a Saturday night in the middle of the pandemic from then print curator Karen Brewer saying, and the subject line was like, interested in buying your piece. And I'm like, what spam is this? What is this? Is someone messing with me? And I open it and it's like, hi, I work at the DeYoung and we put the prices on everybody's work. So we want to act now that the show is open and we want to buy your piece if that's okay. Is it still available? And here's my cell phone. And I was like, it's real. I'm calling the cell phone, So I hope, that can happen again sometime, but it was a major, major step in my art career to be acquired by a museum that could even say on the occasion of the museum's 125th anniversary, it was just, it's still an amazing thing.
I again forgot the question, but I think I'll just follow what Cheryl said. You speak so nicely, Cheryl. I just want to listen to you.
Great question.
Yes. Oh, yeah. What did I forget to mention? Last month, my representation was announced with Jessica Silverman Gallery, and, that type of a relationship. And, something I always say is that I'm a really good doer. Like, I work really hard, but sometimes I lack in the dreaming department, like, as in where my work can go and where I can go. So that's a really good team now that I get to kind of rely on to help me dream better and bigger. But one thing that, I remember that has changed drastically, and it started very early there, was I remember the panel that, Tim was kind of moderating, the panel December 2nd, 2020. And and Tim brought this really wonderful question forward for Machinery of Oppression, which has a really funny acquisition history story too. And that question, Tim kind of put together a lot of historical context to what I was speaking about in that work, and then my way of making, and then my way of expressing. And of course, hopefully I answered that question well on that panel. But one thing I understood is that before that time, not having interacted with as many curators or as many, what I like to call them, storytellers or people who give context to what you do, I felt like I had to do that also. It's one thing to make, but then it's another to also present the context and the historical relation and the relationships that your work shows and your work develops. I've always felt as an artist, it's my responsibility to speak about the work, but I also felt like I had to give the academic context, the art historic context for my work. And that's one thing that has changed a little bit, where I can rely on these beautiful curators I get to meet now and interact with and talk to, on how they see what's happening in the work, and I get to steal their words and get to steal their thoughts on it. And I think that's something that I felt like I was on my own before. And story of the acquisition of that painting, Machinery of Oppression, is I've always believed that I want my work to be owned by female collectors, because I think as someone who thinks of legacy very, very often, thinks that female legacies are important, and maybe that's one way of ensuring we don't get erased. So that work, the DeYoung email came like 4 days after I'd already kind of sold it to a female collector, who then gifted it to the Asian Art Museum, which was a beautiful circle. But that email in itself was a great way of also receiving the type of standard of email you should expect from an institution for a work they're interested in. And I think that was a really good template, to then move forward in the career and see what happens and what people you meet, and the amount of respect and the amount of care any type of communication can present and should show.
By the way, a couple times people have mentioned the theme of the 2020 show, which was On the Edge. I don't think there's a similar theme for this year's, but just in case, we didn't mention that.
Well, this is going to be brief. I basically want to thank Cheryl for encouraging me to apply a second time, because I was like, am I going to get in a second time? Because you don't know who the jurors are, and I decided keep it really simple this time and enter it and just see what happens, and I was accepted.
One of my selections, by the way.
Thank you, Suddy.
Full circle. Okay, great. So my next question is, what is your response to the 2023 DeYoung Open? And if you'd like, you could talk about how you'd like to see the show evolve and continue. But also, I'm just curious, what are your responses And I would just, say for myself, I had a medical procedure when the show actually opened. So today was my first viewing of the show, and it was so overwhelming and moving to see it. And it was just, I don't know, it just was such a good feeling to see those works that I remember so well. And in the jurying process, you're going through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of images. But you're doing that over and over and over again to kind of arrive at this selection. And in the process, you're really like falling in love with a lot of artworks. And so I feel like I was reunited with a lot of old friends today in the exhibition. And it really is such an authentic show. And that can be, for myself, it felt overwhelming in a beautiful way. So, but I'm curious what your responses are to the show.
Keep it brief this time. I saw it today also for the first time, and I think the one thing I do when I look at a work is I always imagine the artist making it, and I imagine being like sitting next to them and seeing them make it. And I was overwhelmed by the amount of different ways of making I could imagine, all next to each other. And the blue walls are also amazing. I don't know, because I don't think the walls were painted in 2020. But yeah, it's just a great feeling of knowing that there's so many artists making, and that is a huge commitment to just make every day. And for me, that was a very overwhelming expression of the show today. Yeah.
Two thoughts. One, when I first saw the show, I was like, I'm a very visual person, so when I walked in and I felt this sense of openness, as opposed to that wall that was there in 2020, I was like, this is great. And then noticing the color of the walls, it felt like the works worked better together as opposed to having white walls where everything is very spotty. This just blended the works together. And then hearing from my friends who accompanied me, they were amazed how much they enjoyed the show this time because it felt more inviting and easier to look at. I will say one of the best things that I have ever experienced was the artist reception. It was a room full of artists only, and there were hundreds of us. I forgot what the number is, but it was 500 or 600 artists in this space. There you go, 641. It was incredible, and it was just artists, no spouses, no children, it was just the artists. So it was an opportunity to celebrate with each other that I really, really appreciated a lot. I think one of the things, and I talked about this with Sunny a little bit, is that I felt that there could be larger sculptural pieces in the space. And maybe there aren't people who aren't applying because of the restrictions in size, so maybe there's some adjustment that could be made in that regard so that there is more conversation between the sculpture and the art. That's about it.
Yeah, today was my first time seeing the show too, and it's always so much fun to see friends work on the wall and be able to like go, oh, there's so-and-so's work, and I'm so happy to see it, or in some cases sculpture, and then to learn about new artists, that I don't know, and it's great to see how many people are like pursuing art practice in the Bay Area. There's a few papers, and I like those papers, but they get going with doom loop, and I'm like, I don't know about that. I'm not really seeing that given this level of creativity that this show is expressing. And so I think, like Ron, I definitely felt the openness in this show in the way it was arranged, and that was very pleasant to see. And on the other hand, I feel like, with 2020 and the show I was in, it felt the way it was supposed to feel for that theme on the edge. I mean, you came in and it was like, okay, here we go. Racial reckoning, that was happening. And then the next one was like isolation, you just really saw it. So I know people have, we've all said it a million ways, but, deep thanks to the curators as well as to the preparators, as well as to, all the exhibition designers, because you see the care that everyone puts into making the show look as great as it does, both in 2020 and 2023. And we're excited for 2026, right? Triennial.
That's right. Yeah, I agree. Kudos to the exhibition design team. The curation, I thought, was outstanding, and it's so pleasurable to look through and see the placement of pieces and how the meaning can shift in proximity to other works, and to be able to have the agency as an audience member to find themes, and find connections, and that's really gratifying. As well as what you were mentioning, just the acknowledgement that there are thousands of artists in the Bay Area. We need to be reminded of this. There are thousands of active artists in the Bay Area still, despite what anyone will tell you about the cost of living or those things. So that's just really so encouraging and exciting. And this show is a great testament to that reality. So I have a couple more questions. Are we still okay on time? Yeah, great. Okay. So now I would like to ask each of you a specific question based on your work and what you presented today. And I'm going to start with you, Cheryl. By the way, I grew up in the Washington D.C. area too, so we'll have to compare notes sometime. And was taken to Monticello like at least once a year. So I was really moved by your work on James Hemings and the inventory, and I feel like I've also learned about just how much of American cuisine comes from his experience, right? Like macaroni and cheese and like so many things, right? That he learned about on his sort of residency in France, and then brought back. Such a rich, complex history there. I was kind of curious about two things. One is that I feel like glass as a medium is often associated nowadays with a kind of contemporary craft movement, and I really love the way that you kind of redirected our gaze toward the factory system and glass and its role, and the role of individuals, including kids, who were involved in, the burgeoning, capitalist, production of glass. And I was also really moved by some of your phrasing, tracking immortality, landscapes of safety, some of the titles of the exhibitions that you've been a part of, Two-Way Mirror, and the reference to double consciousness there. And so I was also thinking about kind of the transparency and the liquidity of glass, right? Because glass is sort of, I think technically it's a liquid, right? It's sort of temporarily solidified, but always a liquid in some way. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that kind of constellation, whether it's the craft versus sort of factory kind of dialectic in glass, or this idea of a double mirror, something that's kind of shifting, a medium that shifts, and how that plays into how you think about your work.
That's good. Thank you. I'm going to keep it brief, like Rupy said, because we could definitely go on all of that. So I think, the first thing, I actually use a term of my own making. I talk about fine craft, because I don't think we should continue to have a conversation about fine art versus craft. And I'm like, no, there's fine craft. There are people who work in media that are craft media in a fine art context. And I think I'm one of those people. And so with glass itself, it's only been 60 years since we've had those big furnaces from factories small enough to be in institutional settings like educational facilities or museum settings, specifically when we talk about glass blowing. With the kiln work, it's a little easier because the kilns have always been a little smaller, or, as they got adapted over the years for glass from ceramics. I think with my own work, I am in a conversation with portraiture, and I'm interested in how we expand our view of portraiture. So I think on paper, the DeYoung's piece is very much a portrait. How do we look at the body without really looking at the body? So the bullet, is the stand-in for the body. And we begin to see these portraits of Black men who were killed by the police. And similarly, I think that in working with glass has always been in conversation with portraiture, beginning with daguerreotype and photography on the glass plate into, cameo engraving work. So if I could pretend to be the curator for a minute, I like to situate my work in a conversation with portraiture.
Wow, I love that layer. I didn't even think of that. It's beautiful. Thank you. Okay, Rupy. Let's see. I was so moved by your words and your presentation. How you talked about kind of layered experiences, finding home, highlighting silences, painting ancestors, giving space to pigments. Thought that was beautiful. Your phrase, given a needle to solve a big problem. And I'm curious about your thoughts on how this term, which you rightfully pointed out, the miniature painting is such a colonial term, right? It's a very minimizing term, especially given how much sacred art, is of a smaller scale. Think of relics and, all kinds of things. So I'm curious what is happening for you in the shift to these monumental scale pieces, going from the smaller scale to pieces that, like the ones that are in your show right now at the ICA, which is such a gorgeous show, such an amazing show. Going up to 3 feet, 5 feet, and larger. What does that mean for you to monumentalize something that has been minimized, not by your own choosing, but by those structures that you're critiquing in your work?
I can't keep it brief on this one. I think there's a personal effort to minimize in general when you are conditioned to minimize yourself, and that could be a product of your environment, your conditioning, your society, whatever it is that you live in. So I think in general, my effort is always to decrease that minimization and then find space and take up space. Now that could come through using language in titles, using Punjabi in titles, or it could come with painting the women larger. And then there's a practical side of it, is that my studio is the 3rd floor of the house. So at this point, where now I have 40 by 60 linen pieces started in the studio, and I paint on the floor, because a lot of the way the pigments work and a lot of the way that even traditionally I've been trained, a lot happens on the floor. Actually, the wall is not really, that's why when I see my work on a wall, it's just a different experience because it's painted on the floor. There's a sense that I want to capture where, the tools I'm using are still tailoring to that detail and that attention to detail, because the tool is still, that squirrel hair brush that is very typical of this painting style, which is about 2 to 3 hair at the tip. And whether it's linen, whether it's 5 feet, whether it's, 8 by 10, whether it's, a 12 by 12, whatever it is, that's the brush. And that's a given. So for me, I think the material is so important, and that's where my effort to perfect and to be really good lies, that when it comes to the surface and the size of the surface, that is more of a decision of does scale make this better? Does scale make this expression, this idea, the effort, and also the viewer experience? I'm always thinking of the viewer when I paint. And I think the viewer in my head is always this 15-year-old girl, actually, who maybe looks like me. And what does she need to see? So scale in that way has become very important. Because I think in general also, the women that I've been brought up by and the woman I am, minimization is such an innate thing that I need to maximize things a little bit for my... And then also, this term of Indian miniature painting, and miniature was a term that the British gave to the style because they had to differentiate between fresco and then paintings, and this was the closest thing that they had, so it's a mislabel. in itself, it's a mislabel and actually don't use it very often. But I know art historians don't talk as often to artists, so they still end up using that term, but artists don't necessarily use that term. We just say Indian painting, traditional Indian painting. So in that way, the smallness is not how you're not trained for smallness in that way. You're trained for smallness is that what is that one single hair brushstroke going to change and do for that painting? And for me, when I'm doing that, it's very close to, what is one small person going to do in this world? What is one small day going to do in a year? So in that context, and the reason I have time to think all these things is because it takes ages to do the work. It takes a while. You're not building the highlights the way traditional Western painting does. You build the highlights through a single brushstroke at a time. So you have time to think about things, and you have time to change your mind, come back to the initial idea and stay with it. You don't have time to doubt yourself at the painting stage because you've already put in the work so much before. And I think I've lost track of the question.
I think you answered it beautifully. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, Ron. So with your presentation, first of all, I'm so struck by this idea of taking photographs without a camera, and this idea of kind of removing the lens, and in a way, I relate it to Rupy's question, sort of like removing a certain kind of framing, removing certain assumptions. And you made a beautiful reference to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and just your description of like physically laying people, onto these surfaces. I still can't work out in my mind exactly how you do it. But I know it has to do with physical bodies. It has to do with light and physical bodies in real time. And so the works become indexical and become, they carry these traces of this activity, this action that is quite profound and quite radical, given that legacy of photography. And we think of this term like capturing a photo, capturing a likeness. Even early fears around photography, right? Catching someone's soul. And I'm just so inspired to think about this idea of bringing the body into these pieces and making visible. I think all of you do that in various ways, making the invisible visible. I was also really moved by your bringing in of the wisdom and the technology of plants and the healing properties of plants, and the notion of the dragonfly in terms of resilience and the tenderloin. And so I wonder if you, there's so many, I guess, layers to this question, but finally leading up to one of the last pieces that you showed, We Are Water, which evokes so many different things for me. You have this very physical, kind of sensual use of light again and liquid that are so much a part of the photographic process typically. But then you also have people swimming, and thinking about sort of the history of segregation in swimming pools, for example, but also, again, this healing property of water. Water is life. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of like the magic that you're doing, as you bring together, all of these different elements for work that is truly healing for your audiences and perhaps for yourself.
Well, thank you for noticing the healing aspect of the work, because that's one of the things that I hope the work does. There's a lot of positivity in the work, and the physical aspects of the work are, when I'm particularly using the body, which is most of the time my body, it requires me to climb on top of tables. It requires me to contort my body in certain ways because I have an image in my head that I want to capture, and that it might mean twisting my arms in a certain way. But then I also want to talk about the interior aspect of my life. I'm an only child. I'm an orphan now because my parents are both deceased. And the question is, and it's a really simple question, who am I and where did I come from? And that's one of the questions that I always ask myself when I'm creating the work. And it could be me making believe I'm jumping rope. And what does my hair look like when I'm jumping rope? So I will configure my hair on the paper. So just to back up a little bit, so a photogram is literally taking objects and laying them on the paper. And in some ways, it's capturing the shadow. So you can see there's a shadow that my hand casts, and it's blocking the light. And that's what the paper is capturing. And so it's a white silhouette. But then I'm looking at how do I add texture to that to actually expand the conversation about the body, about the Black body, about our bodies. And there's still, it's really interesting. Every now and then you hear these conversations about what percentage of water do you have in your body? 60, 50, 40, 80. And it's right around 70. But it's to have that conversation about water. And I'm actually, is the element that I'm going back to, looking at how important water has been for the Black diaspora. And again, people may not see that right away, but using my body with water and moving my fingers just a little bit makes it more three-dimensional and gives a certain aspect that people can really grasp onto. So the work is not so two-dimensional anymore. There's an illusion of a third dimension. So I'm looking at ways to tell stories in a very non-traditional way by using the body, using elements that can express it and that can express life.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Whew. Okay. Well, at this point, I think I should open it up to the audience to see if any of you have questions for our panelists. Do we have a microphone out in the audience? Okay, great. So if you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and someone will come to you with a microphone. Anyone? Yes.
How have your inner children, your inner child's been healed through your work and through your success?
Did everyone hear that? How have your inner children been healed through your work and through your success?
I don't think they're healed ever. I'm trying to look for a word as in maybe there's progress that's been made, but I think the beautiful thing about being an artist is that your inner child stays alive. And that's more important, I feel. That's such a good feeling, that my inner child stays alive. My ability to wonder, to look at a tree and imagine it being painted, and to look at someone's profile and imagine it in the style I do. So I think my inner child stays alive, and maybe that's how it's healed. Or that's how it stays sort of healed.
I agree. There's healing that's happening, and I don't think it's complete. And for me, when I am looking at plant material, and I invite you all to do this when you're going out, look up at the trees, look at the leaves of the tree, and look at the way the sunlight is coming through the leaf. That's what I'm capturing. So for me, it's always approaching my work as a child and saying, oh, what would happen if I do this? What would happen if I did that? What would happen if I took it apart? So it's looking at it, thinking about it as a child would approach it.
I always say that, architects and city planners are people whose parents told them, please get a day job, because they were really artists and activists. And so I think, at some point, we all come back to who we really were, which was artists and activists. And so, moments like this allow that core being, that you knew you were in childhood, who grew up and got a day job to make your parents happy, is reaffirmed in the space of art.
Wonderful. Another question? No other questions. Okay, well, I know, oh yes, we have one here.
allocation, or are you seeing, are we tapped out at 8,000? Yeah, and what do you think the trajectory is for the next open?
I could answer that. I actually know the numbers,
Yeah.
for better or worse.
Did everyone hear that? So the question was, how do the numbers differ in terms of new artists applying the second time around?
Is this working? Is that working? No, it's not. Okay. See what I said about modern technology? Just FYI, 27 purely AI works were submitted. Not one of them made it in, despite the fact there were 12 different jurors. So very interesting, because they were all divided up. So very interesting. That won't be true next time. There'll be hundreds, if not thousands. Anyway, so here are some of the answers. We allowed artists to submit 2 works last time, as you heard and as you know. And there were 12,514 submissions, but many of those were 2 works by the same artist, right? So within 7 is the number of works on display each time in 2020 and 2023. Amazing, but it sort of makes sense, with that 883 versus 877 in 2020. So, it all evens out in the end because they're approximately the same sizes. There were 129 artists in 2023 who were also in the 2020. I thought it would be higher, honestly, but now we know that Cheryl did not apply, so it's her fault. The whole team, which is almost everybody at the museum that works on these projects, the goal is to improve what we're doing every 3 years, now that it's a triennial. And so everyone was unanimous, for example, in 2020, that the artists sell their work and be allowed to keep their work. I just found out last week that the Royal Academy Summer Show actually keeps 30% of the sales price, which I did not know. And they also charge a fee to submit your work that, depending on the pound exchange rate, is, I think, around $80, which is not nothing, as I remember from my younger days. So this year, in planning for 2023, everyone was also unanimous that artists should submit 1 work only, because we wanted to expand the sort of availability and openness and accessibility to as many artists as possible, because it gives everyone, as you've just heard, such a great forum to be seen and heard and interact with everybody, including members of the art world. So there were 1,500 more artists who applied this year. So that was a really, from our perspective, a really resounding success that the message got out there. We did our best in 2020. 2 of the curators in my department, Emma Acker and Lauren Palmore, and with the help of others on the museum team, compiled a list of over 900 Bay Area arts organizations, everything from galleries to museums to collectives to the East Bay Quilters Guild, Creativity Explored, everything you could possibly think of to get the word out. But of course, the best word is word of mouth, and I think that's what happened this time. That's honestly probably, and you talking to your friends and say, you should apply, and whatever, or apply again. I think that's what really happened. So you're correct, the number of artists who only could do 1 work, so that's number of artists. The number of works and artists submitted this year was 7,766. And so to your question, is 8,000 where we are, where we're sort of tapped out? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. It's actually, I'll be honest, because none of us knew. I thought that was an astonishing number. Just a moment ago, the suggestion, isn't this great that thousands of artists are still working in the Bay Area and making significant work? So I thought that was pretty great for, the city proper is whatever it is, 800,000, and then the Bay Area total, maybe 3 million or whatever the number is. I thought that was pretty great. 8,000 is a lot. And I was also, surprised, but maybe also gratified that only 129 artists from the last show were in this exhibition, and maybe some people decided not to apply, not to try their luck or whatever. But that so many more applied is really great, and that's what we want. So it's possible that 8,000 plus or minus, but I have a feeling we'll get more next time. I have heard from we took a survey last time. We're going to do it again this time to actually ask artists what their experience was. And one of the questions last time was, did you sell work? And of the people who answered, 1/3 of the artists sold their work. But I can also tell you, unlike the 641 artists at Artist Day last time, I think maybe 150 people showed up, if even that, because people were scared. It was Delta, and everyone was sheltering in place. So I mentioned I've already received multiple emails from multiple artists who've sold multiple works. I sold the one in the show, but people wrote me and asked if I have others. And I mean, this is just the best thing ever, right? Artists work hard, they make amazing work, they deserve to be compensated, and more importantly, they deserve to have their works be seen. You work in isolation, but you want them to be seen in public, or at least by an appreciative person or people. And so that's really, really great. And we'll do that survey at the end. I think given our attendance now, I haven't checked recently, we're probably up around 35, 40,000 people already that have seen the DeYoung Open. So that's a huge audience, and a lot of those people are buying works that mean something to them, you know, and so that's really great. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for the opportunity to serve as a juror. It was just a tremendous opportunity. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much to our beautiful 3 artists today. Thank you for the care and thoughtfulness with which you addressed us today. Thank you so much to our audience members for coming out today. Again, on such a beautiful day. Thank you for your support of the show and of artists in the Bay Area. I know some of you are artists, and some of you are also in the show as well. So congratulations to you. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a beautiful rest of your weekend.
Thank you.